can't help thinking that at this moment in time, it is the 29th of October 2020, I feel like this documentary is exceptionally pointless. And I have several reasons for that. Now, there are some interesting things about Madeleine McCann, the hunt for the prime suspect, but for the most part, it adds nothing new. It points fingers in what could end up being the wrong direction, and could be very dangerous in taking attention away from other suspects. It's a very dangerous game this documentary is playing. So this is about an hour long, currently on ITV, and the first half of the documentary kind of recaps on the case of Madeleine McCann. It doesn't add any new information about what happened at the time. It doesn't add any new information about sightings or suspects who were seen at the time 13 years ago in 2007. The second half of the documentary begins to look at this new suspect, and that is kind of where the problem comes along. So he was known as Christian B, and his real name was later revealed as Christian Brueckner, and at the time of recording, yesterday, it was reported that the police, I think the German police, are going back to Priadeluge to try and get the final bits of evidence, if they can, to convict Brueckner. And I think they've kind of worded it as saying this is our last chance to get this guy. In the documentary just kind of tells us his background and the things that he's done, and there's no footage of things he's done, there are no crime scene photos of things he's done, so it's not a very compelling anecdote. It's just, this is who he is, this is where he lived, this is what he did, or this is what he has done in the past that's led to him being convicted of various other crimes. The only one thing that this documentary taught me that I didn't know was that Brueckner's phone was linked to a mast very near that tapas bar on the day of the abduction. That is the only bit of information that this documentary delivers. And that may have been reported in an article or in the press elsewhere. I personally hadn't read that. But everything else is very basic knowledge that most of us, or anybody who pays any attention to the development of this case, will have heard. So the documentary adds absolutely nothing new apart from that one snippet. It's not very well put together. It doesn't use any real kind of photos, images. There are a couple of interviews from back in the day with the McCanns. But other than that, there's nothing that would help anybody watching this suddenly have a jog of memory and think, oh, actually, 13 years later, I suddenly remember this bit of information. There is nothing in this that could help to find Madeleine McCann. And the other problem I have with this is that this is basically saying these are all the things, well, the one thing that links Brueckner to this crime. It's basically just saying he's bad because of this, 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 and this, and his phone was near this mast. And that's very dangerous because, first of all, it means that this documentary is saying, well, obviously he did it, nobody else could be suspect. And it's also very dangerous because what if he didn't do it? Now, I'm not saying he didn't do it, I'm not saying I don't think he did it. Quite frankly, I don't know which way to go. I think he knows things. Whether or not he was responsible, I'm not sure. But if he didn't do it, what was the point in this documentary? This would have been better if they'd waited. I think it was back in July, by the way, this documentary was made. And if they had waited and actually waited until he'd been convicted, or completely ruled out, but then the documentary would be definitely pointless. If he'd been convicted, then this would be a really fascinating documentary, and I would have liked to look a deeper look at his past, his mind, his childhood, how he became this vile human being, because he has done a lot of horrible things in his life. But unfortunately, it didn't do that. It just tells us a bit about this horrible person, the one thing that maybe meant he was there. Well, I guess you could say the two things, because there were witnesses who heard him say something in a pub, but that's common knowledge. We know that. The phone near the mast, as I said, for me was new information and quite interesting. But everything else was just pointless. They didn't go into detail about any other suspects, or what the police had maybe done wrong in the past, or where the focus had shifted. They did not at any point mention how she was abducted. You know, the fact that she was sleeping on her own with the twins in a different, obviously in a different cot. They didn't go into detail about the setup of the hotel or the apartments and how the abductor would have got in. There was absolutely no useful information for anybody in this documentary. And it's just really frustrating because I have been emotionally involved in this case since I was 15, because this is kind of the first time I was old enough to follow the facts of an international crime. And I've always felt very strongly that she has to be found and somebody has to come forward. And I believe in my heart that one day that will happen. And I think that this documentary was a waste of everybody's time, but it was also very dangerous, as I said, because not only does it not add any information, but I think it could convince people that Brueckner is guilty. And if he turns out to be guilty, fantastic. Well, not fantastic, but, you know, the documentary in hindsight could be interesting to watch. Moderately, but then people could do a lot more interesting interviews and documentaries, rather. But it doesn't add any value. It takes away value. It's quite a dangerous thing to do. It was a waste of an hour. I got very angry. As I said, I learned one thing. But it's not going to help anybody. It doesn't help the case. And all it, I mean, on the bright side, it puts Madeleine McCann's name back out there for a bit more. It reminds people of her story. I will give the documentary credit where credit is due. That's always going to be a good thing. I'd rather see documentaries that are appalling, but putting McCann's name out there, rather than silence. But given that there are quite a few other documentaries that are really good, really intricate, and actually add more value than this, it's a complete waste of everybody's time. If you've seen it, I hope you enjoyed it. Personally, I would say go to Netflix and watch, I think it's called The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It's the Madeleine McCann documentary on Netflix. It's an 8-parter. It gives you a very thorough analysis of the time, of suspects, of different things that were going on. It doesn't, to my knowledge, mention Christian B, because that was after that. But as I said, this basically isn't about his involvement anyway, and is completely pointless, and is, I suppose you could say it's defamation of character, because this documentary is pointing fingers when he hasn't necessarily done it. But we'll see how that pans out, hopefully, when the German police get to go back over to Portugal. And I hope with all my heart that if he did it, he's convicted and he reveals where she is. But I doubt he will. But let's cross our fingers. You know, sending prayers to the McCanns. I hope she is found. This documentary doesn't do anything to help that, though.